the Greece situation. Any more on that? What else are you looking at? And then what's some good news?
Well, before I even mention Greece, as long as you're talking about McDonald's and restaurant sales, on the retail sales numbers that came out this week, we actually had a drop in restaurant and bar sales by 0.2%. That's the biggest decline since January of 2014. And, the problem is, college grads need a vibrant restaurant business because that's where they get their jobs. You graduate from college and then you can land a job at McDonald's. And so that's going to be problematic for our college grads. But as far as Greece is concerned, unfortunately, right, Greece is going to make a deal with the devil. They're going to stay in the Eurozone, but they're going to borrow even more money to do it. So the Greek people are going to go deeper into debt because the Greek government didn't want to deal with the consequences of abandoning socialism. You see, they need Europe's money to continue to make payments to Greek voters, even if they have to deliver some bad news and tell Greek pensioners and government workers that they're going to have to take some cuts. They would have to take much bigger cuts if they actually left the Eurozone. But that would actually be a good thing because what we need is less government in Greece and more freedom. Instead, they're going to agree to higher taxes. They're going to continue to keep people on the dole. And ultimately, there's going to be some kind of violent revolution in Greece because this is not going to work, what's going on.
Is this about Western governments and the robber baron class living for the day and just robbing the bank, trying to build their armored redoubt, in some faraway place as they're now doing, headed for the exits, that there really isn't a big conspiracy? They kind of had a big global government talk to act like they had an exit plan, but really their exit plan is the collapse of civilization with all the stealing and the socialism and the redistribution, because they never back off the socialism or the corporate welfare. They seem to only double down. And if you study history, I mean, I was reading yesterday in the London Telegraph and also in several other papers, they say Rome is a rotting, festering rat hole now. Just 10 years ago, it was nice. Other mega cities are falling apart. I was back in New York recently. It looked like a third world country. It looked nice 10 years ago. I go to L.A. It looks scary, except in certain areas. I go to Dallas. I grew up there. It looks scary. What is going on?
Yeah, well, first, it was a mistake for the European countries to have come together in a union. It was, because of politicians that wanted more power, that they sold it to the people. But it wasn't a good deal, not because it's preventing Greece from printing more money. Right. The problem is it's putting all these countries together is just growing the government. And I know Germany couldn't afford to allow the moral hazard of forgiving the Greek debt. So they have to keep them in there just so they can send a message to everybody else. But, it was a mistake now looking back for our states to have come together. The 12 initial colonies, given where we are today, we would be better off had they never formed a central government and had they stayed independent states. Maybe had we operated under the Articles of Confederation instead of the Constitution, because what the original framers intended was a very small federal government with very little power that would only tax us in times of war.
And it would only deal with disputes between the states.
Yeah, and now we have an all-powerful federal government. I think most states would be better off seceding from the Union. The average state would be better off if he wasn't part of the United States, if it was a separate country and it can operate with a lot less money. But now we're stuck together in this very imperfect union.
Well, I agree with you. And, I've said we can have the states secede under the Declaration of Independence and then reform with a real limited federal government.
Because we saw what happened last time. They tried that. There were some southern states that tried that, and we had, the Civil War. So it didn't work out so well. And then as a result of the Civil War, we got paper money, we got the income tax, we got all kinds of other bad things.
But see, you're a smart guy. You know the real history of that. It had nothing to do with slavery until the end. And 2% of the South had slaves. It's a total red herring. It was all about Western expansion, all about tariffs in the North on Southern goods. And then they just tell the public, no, it was about hating black people, when in truth, that's why Robert E. Lee was the top general in the North, the commandant of West Point. They wanted him to be the head of the Northern forces. And he said, I don't want to do this, but this is illegal what you're doing. I have to go join the South. And Robert E. Lee hated slavery.
Yeah, first of all, slavery was bad, no question about it. At least the one good thing that came out of the Civil War was that it ended. Of course, it would have ended anyway, eventually. But, there was more racism in the North than there was in the South. But the reality was that Lincoln didn't free the slaves until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. We were 2 years into the war. And the reason he did that was because France was threatening to come to the aid of the South. And so Lincoln had to make it about slavery rather than about something else. So it ended up that we got to free the slaves, but that's not why the war started.
But again, you read books, you read history, which makes you a racist. Yeah, I'm being sarcastic, because with the new political correctness, they just trump our facts with just claiming we're racist, we're right-wing, we're hateful. I mean, I don't think you call yourself right-wing. What do you call yourself? Just a free market guy?
Yeah, look, I would have loved it if Thomas Jefferson had had his way and the original Declaration of Independence emancipated the slaves, but we wouldn't have had the document. They had to cave in. And just because I understand the true history of the Civil War doesn't mean I'm pro-slavery.
No, exactly.
Slavery is horrible. And the fact is, it's bad economics. That's why it was dying out all over the world. There's only, I think, maybe one other nation in the world that fought a war to end slavery. Every place else that had it, it went away on its own. And it would have gone away. It might have taken another 20 years, but we wouldn't have had Jim Crow. We wouldn't have had a lot of the problems and the animosity that existed following that Civil War. And so I think ultimately the descendants of slaves would have been much better off had we not fought that war. They would be free today. But I think, and the nation we would have saved millions of lives. The economic damage that resulted from that war was horrific. And the government used the war to usurp all sorts of powers. I mean, I think if we never fought that Civil War, we wouldn't have the income tax today. We might not have the Federal Reserve. We might still be on a gold standard. And we wouldn't have any slaves, so we'd all be a lot freer.
Well, plus, if they do the background, most Americans that came here of any color, their ancestors came here after the Civil War. Most white people have no connection to slavery. And so it's just asinine.
Well, of course not. And of course, very few whites owned slaves. And in fact, there were even some blacks that owned slaves. So, it wasn't like, it was only whites. But look, it was a terrible thing. Slavery is the worst thing.
No, I totally agree. The issue is we're here watching the country in deep trouble, and this is still the biggest issue out there that they use as a diversion.
It is a diversion. And look, I'm Jewish. I mean, there were Jews that were enslaved at one point too. But I'm not, I'm not owed anything as a result of it. We have real economic problems, and we have modern slavery.
So the Babylonians and the Egyptians don't owe you anything?
No, we're all slaves to the U.S. government. The way I look at it, this is one big giant plantation, and the government takes half of everything I earn, and then they try to control everything that I do. The slave owner only got 10% of his slave's production. So the U.S. government gets a lot more from me economically than any plantation owner got out of its slaves.
That's right.
And so we have to get rid of these chains. We have to free ourselves, emancipate ourselves from this current system, and we have to go back to what the founders envisioned, not just for us, but for all the people of the United States, black, white, immigrants, whoever it is. We all need to be free.
I agree. Peter Schiff, powerful point. In 60 seconds closing, how do we launch a peaceful global slave revolt worldwide to stand up and say, we're paying 60, 70% in France, 80, 90% to a bunch of corrupt government bureaucrats that are above the law and tax exempt in most cases. That's the most incredible part about it, is that we are truly slaves. How do we become free again, Peter Schiff?
I don't know. I mean, my dad tried it. He's 87 years old and he's still in jail because he stood up for the Constitution and wasn't paying.
By the way, your dad is in prison for writing a book.
Well, writing books and advocating that people follow the law the way he sees it and not pay taxes. So you can't just stop paying unless you're willing to risk going to jail like my father. I mean, look, we can vote. We can vote for Rand Paul. We can vote for people who profess to support the Constitution and stand for liberties. But it is very difficult. And, we've got an army of Americans now who are beholden to the federal government. They divvy up the loot that the government steals, outvote us. So it's very difficult. We are enslaved by democracy. And the founding fathers, also didn't like democracy. They tried to save us from democracy by creating a republic, but the republic has collapsed and we're living under the tyranny of democracy.